right, welcome to Shift, a podcast where we share stories of people overcoming their own internal BS to really come out of their comfort zones and grow in their personal and professional lives. My aim here is to help people recognize that there's a lot of undiscovered parts to ourselves that await us if we're just willing to get out of those comfort zones and just get out our own way. My name is Elena Agarikimova, your host, and today I'm super excited to have with me Mark Metry. Mark is an author and coach of Screw Being Shy, helping introverted professionals and entrepreneurs and teenagers to be themselves in front of anyone. As a 23-year-old, he's been featured on over 250 podcasts and media like Forbes, Mindvalley, Influenctive, Inc. magazine, and many, many more. His podcast, Humans 2.0, includes his thoughts, views, podcasts, and videos that's been viewed for over 50 million times. His podcast is now hit number 96 of the top podcasts in the world, alongside with Tim Ferriss, NPR, Lewis Howes, and Gary V, of course. Mark, welcome to the show.
Elena, thank you so much for having me. And I don't know, you said this podcast is about how to overcome the internal BS. We may need to make this 2 hours because I have so much of that I can say. But thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And yes, I'm sure we can speak for hours. But listen, I have a few questions in mind for you. And I want to start with can you share with us something that maybe many people don't know about you? I know you're quite out there and you speak on your experience, but is there anything that comes to mind that most people don't know about you?
Yeah. So, for me, what most people don't know about me. When I was a kid, I traded and collected Pokemon cards. And I don't know if you've been seeing the hype around Pokemon cards now, but now their value has skyrocketed. And in 2017, I sold all my Pokemon cards, I think for $1,000.
That's awesome.
And literally, if I had traded them in today, I could maybe have an extra $400,000. And so that just goes to show you that you can regret anything in your past, but what's the point of regret? It just takes you down if it's something that you can't change in the present.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that one.
I don't even know where that came from.
See, that's the purpose of that question. So listen, I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of introversion, social anxiety. I know this is something you write quite a bit about. You've done a lot of research, you've experienced it yourself, but I want to just ask you to differentiate, because to be honest, this is something I recently learned from you, is what is the difference between somebody being shy versus somebody being an introvert versus somebody being socially anxious?
Yeah. So in terms of being an introvert or extrovert, being an introvert basically means that you're the way that your natural brain works is you're more likely to, when you think and feel, you think and you feel things inside of you. And so a lot of the times in your head, you're always thinking, always coming up with ideas, feeling things, looking at patterns, trying to analyze things. Whereas extroverts, the way that their brain normally handles things is they think on the outside. And so they have to have some sort of external stimuli to think and to be themselves. Whereas introverts, it's just more internal. And so you can be an introvert and you can not be shy. You can be very confident. And so when it comes to shyness, being shy is a totally natural, human emotion. And there's a lot of people where, it's you ask a girl out or a guy out for the first time and you're shy, or you go somewhere new for the first time in your life and you're shy for that first meeting. That's totally normal. Whereas social anxiety, it is basically this, what I would say is the best way I could describe it is, so how if you break your leg, right, you go to the doctor and then your doctor's like, okay, you fractured it right here. What we need to do is we need to wrap you up with a cast. We need to have the cast on for a month, and then we're going to give you crutches. And then after that, we're going to cut the cast and put a different kind of cast for another 2 weeks. And then it's going to be healed and it's going to go. Basically, social anxiety is when at a young age, you experience some sort of a social traumatic event that could be you facing bullying, racism, being socially humiliated in front of people, moving to a new school, moving to a new area, seeing your parents divorce, break up. And what usually happens is for a percentage of these people, and there's also different things like genetics and your parents that come into fact. It's very complex. But for a percentage of these people who experience that, nobody ever teaches them about the casts and the crutches. And so they basically go their life and there's a part of their brain that is literally broken. And nobody teaches them, hey, this is how you put on the cast. This is what you got to do for a month with the crutches. And then what happens is they're like 25, 30, 35, and they're trying to do these things with their life. But the next thing you know, they can't do the things that they want to do. And why? It's because they have like this heightened social perspective of how they think everybody is viewing them and potentially judging them. And they feel like they can't be themselves. And when they show up in front of other people, they have to act like somebody else. Or if they do, they're going to be rejected or humiliated. And so oftentimes people with social anxiety, they usually are some of like the hardest working people because they're constantly trying to prove themselves. And then also at the same time, a lot of people with social anxiety end up facing other mental health issues because according to like the statistics, at least in America, it takes on average like 5 to 10 years for somebody to realize that they have social anxiety because it's almost like this invisible prison and the software and hardware for your brain that you don't even think about. It just becomes invisible. And then it usually takes another 10 years for someone battling through like this internal mental struggle for them to ask for help. And so, for example, for me in my life, when I faced, social anxiety, it was a time where I don't know if I was like 9 or 10, but my parents, who were immigrants from Egypt that came to America, we moved from the inner city, which was like, there was like a lot of poor people, a lot of different diverse people. And we moved to this small town where there was no racial diversity. And I was the only person who looked physically different from everybody else. And also in this time in America, this was post 9/11. And so if you were Middle Eastern Arab, that was the height of like Middle Eastern racism. And so I faced that as a kid and I'm like, wait, like what? And I just sort of stayed silent and invisible for like 10 years of my life. And it wasn't until I was 18, 19 in college to where all of a sudden I got super depressed. All of a sudden I became obese. All of a sudden I couldn't even hang out with any of my friends. All of a sudden I got suicidal. And I really hit this dark time in my life that really just awoke me to sort of everything that I've said in terms of how this impacts our brains, our minds, and how this is really like, the title of my TEDx talk that I just gave is The Invisible Problem That Stops People from Being Themselves. And so this is like a mental health issue that is extremely neglected around the world. And then they're not the funniest part, but the most interesting part about it is, according to statistics, social anxiety affects people that come from the most, just statistically speaking, from the Middle East and from different parts of Asia. And so there's like this whole evolutionary biology stuff that I can get into of like, why do we even have this as humans? But that's my answer, if that made sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's so important for people to understand the differentiation between these three, because we tend to just kind of like dump it all together, right, in conversations. And to be quite honest with you, you're the one who kind of brought my attention to it. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Because I used to be also one of those people who used to be like, well, it's kind of similar, no, introvert, shy. But in fact, it is different. And social anxiety is just taking it to a different level. And we were chatting before we started recording this, that what came to my realization. So as a kid, I was super outgoing. I was like on sports team. I was like a popular kid in school. And then I moved to the US from Russia at the age of 13. And not to mention at the age of 13, a lot of other things happen as a teenager, and then you're placed in this space with middle schoolers, right? Completely different culture, completely out of the comfort zone. And middle school kids are not kind, let me tell you, at all.
Little demons.
And so I remember I went into myself, and something that people don't know about me is that I didn't have friends for like a good 6 months at least when I first came to the States. And I think I've experienced that social anxiety because I used to avoid going to the cafeteria, to the lunchroom, because I'm like, God forbid I have to go and socialize with people. I felt so judged. I was the only foreign kid in my school. There was another girl, actually. She was also from Russia, but she's been quite acclimated to the culture. But that's it. Like, it was a very, very American kind of school. So, I mean, from all sides, I just felt really, impacted by that. And then it caused me to be very shy. Not even shy, insecure. It went beyond that. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think so many people can too. And I think it's important to differentiate that, because then you're like, oh, okay. And then you can start to kind of unpack that, which I have over the years, but it's, yeah.
It's so important, because like the reality is like whenever I was growing up and people would just call me, oh, you're just like the shy, quiet, introvert kid, then I would be like, oh, okay, all right, I guess I am. But then all of a sudden I'm like, wait, I can't live my life. I can't be myself. And so whereas like someone who actually is just an introvert, they can sort of not grow past that, but they can grow through the proper development stages to not be as shy and to be more confident. Whereas, you don't know, right? So it's like society says that the person who's sitting by themselves at lunch or whatever at the library, they're doing so because he or she is an introvert. Well, it's like, how do we actually know that? They could be, which is nothing wrong with being an introvert, but there's a percentage of those kids who are sitting alone, not because they want to be alone. They actually really want to talk to people. And so after going through this for, years of my life, and just kind of facing it, and then also being a speaker and turning this all around and seeing how common this is, it's quite like damaging to a lot of these people. And there's different things I can talk to, but yeah, at the end of the day, social anxiety, it's a perception that if you don't do something about your social identity, then people will mock you or judge you. And the reality is that this has people working very hard. I have clients of mine who like are CEOs of companies that are doing amazing things, and they have social anxiety. And so it's really about, how do you get on the path of managing and healing this part? Because if you can, this literally becomes like a superpower. And I feel like for me, a lot of the things that I've been able to do in my successes, it comes from social anxiety. But if I didn't get on the productive, proactive path, it would literally be the thing that destroys me every single day. And so there really is like a light and a dark side to it. And it's up to you based on what you learn, what you are consciously aware of, and what you're doing about it.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. So let's say, a two-part question. One side, since you kind of overcame that, I'm curious, if you want to share sort of what helped you, what are the baby steps, if there was like a little process that people can use. And also on the flip side, individuals who might see somebody who is, they might consider shy or introverted, how do you approach them in a way that is comfortable to them, perhaps? Like, what do they prefer?
Yeah. So I can answer that one first. So what you should never do is you should never, ever, ever publicly ask them to speak up or to, can you say something, or never, give them criticism publicly. And so what I would do is, like, if you're in a team, if you're in a startup, if you are working with someone and you realize one of your employees or your kid or something is acting like this way, never say it to them, like in the family table, for example, like, hey, Mark, like, you seem shy. Like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you speaking up? Okay. Never, ever do that. What you should do instead is you should later, when you guys are alone, you should take them to the side and you should say, hey, I've noticed that you aren't really, speaking up. You're not really being yourself. Are you okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Have you been feeling anything? And odds are what happens is, when you tell people with social anxiety in a public setting, what I just sort of gave an example, what will happen is their social anxiety will literally re-trigger. And then next thing you know, they just won't talk, or they'll overthink and they'll give you the wrong answer. And what that'll do is that'll make their social anxiety even worse. And so that's what you don't want to do at all. And so it's really about providing like an open friendship. And it's like, for example, if you have a brother or a son or something, and you realize that like all they're doing is just like sitting inside and playing video games, or like they don't have any friends or something, instead of saying like, hey, like, why aren't you hanging out with your friends, or like, what's wrong with you? You should try to work with them in a cooperative process. And you can say like, hey, like, I hope you're okay. Like, have you been talking with your friends lately? Can I help you to set some sort of, like, I don't know, an appointment with your friend Kevin next 2 weeks from now, whatever works. And so it's really not about forcing them. It's about creating the open and supportive environment and you kind of helping them, but not forcing them. That's the biggest thing. Because I look back to my past, and like, the worst part about this whole thing, Elena, is that you can usually tell, like, if a kid is experiencing this, but the reality is once a kid grows up and they become a teenager and a young adult, the worst part about social anxiety is that you hide it from everybody. And so I remember for me going through these things and having these thoughts, and then, like, literally my head would be like, okay, Mark, we're never going to share any of this stuff to doesn't matter who your family, friends. And then that's how it gets worse and worse. Whereas there's people who have social anxiety and they share it with their family, they share it with their friends, their wife, their husband. And because their partner or whoever isn't open, or maybe they don't, like, for example, there's some people, some cultures that don't think mental health is real, for example. A lot of times what happens is if someone with social anxiety does that and you reject them, or you say, wait, why are you acting like that? Why don't you just speak up? Why aren't you just more confident? I can honestly promise you, you've just severed that relationship, and they will never vulnerably talk to you again unless they get a lot of work internally done with them. And so it's very damaging. And there's people who with social anxiety that are haunted by that for years and years and years, and it stops them from developing relationships. And so that's that. So what did I do to sort of address this? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated answer. What I would say is definitely, if someone's interested in this, definitely read my book or listen to it on Audible, Screw Being Shy. But here's what I would say. So there's layers to what it means to be a human, and there's layers to what it means to have social anxiety. And so the layers of what it means to be a human are, I think that there's a spiritual layer. I think there's a physical layer. I think there's a mental layer. I think there's an emotional layer. And so generally speaking, people with social anxiety, they'll have some sort of deficiency in that kind of an area. Personally, for me, I feel like I was spiritually good. I feel like there's a part of my deep spirit that, like, just knew things were going to be okay. But for me, my real issue was the physical side. And what I mean is this. So going back to the analogy of the crutches and the stretching and your brain breaking, what I would say is, a lot of people, they ask themselves, like, okay, how does the quality of my life come from? If you really break it down, it comes from your thoughts and your emotions and your feelings, right? At a very basic level. And then you have to ask yourself, what produces your thoughts, emotions, and your feelings? And, of course, like, you could say, like, it's yourself interacting with the environment, the physical environment. But ultimately, what's producing that is, like, the neurons and the neurotransmitters that are firing in your brain that have billions of neurons that are controlling your entire life. And so you ask yourself, how does my brain regenerate? How does my brain grow? And again, it could be a complicated answer, but it's kind of like a more complicated house plant, right? It's like you need water and you need food, right? And you need sleep, you need movement. And so that's a big area that I think, especially now, is completely neglected, to where people are so focused on, how do I fix my social anxiety by thinking better, by using my mind? But the reality is you need to actually use your brain first. And so your mind is like the software, and your brain is like the physical hardware. Even if you have the best software in the world, you have the best positive thinking, you read the best books, right, that's never going to fix a broken, outdated hardware.
The base, right?
Yeah, the base. And so a lot of people with social anxiety, they have been thinking and feeling this way for so many years. Like, on average, it takes 10, 15, 20 years for someone with social anxiety to realize and change. And so they've been thinking this for so many years. And so their thought patterns in their brain are hardwired. Like, it's like you try to do something, and then the next day you just go back to doing the same thing you did again. And it's not because you're lazy. It's not because you're stupid. It's not because you're not disciplined enough. It has nothing to do with that. It has to literally do with the neurobiochemical state of your brain. And so one of the biggest things is that when I started on my journey, I accidentally stumbled onto this. And I'm so glad I did, because the first problem that I realized that I had before I even had social anxiety or had other mental health issues was realizing that I was obese. And so what I said to myself was like, hey, Mark, how am I going to lose this weight? Right. And I started Googling, and I was like, how do I lose weight? What's the best diet to follow? Right. And then you come across all this crap and everyone trying to sell you all these different things and programs and stuff. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's crazy. And it gets bigger and bigger every year, while people get more unhealthy every year, which doesn't really make any sense if you think about it. And so for me, I basically stumbled on a lot of smart people that taught me a lot of great things. And basically what I learned is this: we have inside of ourselves this thing called our gut microbiome. And our gut is basically like this ecosystem of trillions of bacteria and single-celled organisms, viruses, fungi that sit in between our intestine and our stomach. And basically, you got your gut microbiome from your mom. She got hers from her. 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 She got hers from hers, all the way until basically the beginning of humanity. And that impacts you. And so one of the biggest things that I've learned is that these bacteria literally run our entire lives. And the last 15 years of science have showed that, for example, we have nerves that connect directly from our brain to our gut and from our gut to our brain. And the biggest thing that I could say is, going back to our thoughts and emotions and that creating our quality of life, one of the big things that produces that is our neurotransmitters. And one of the biggest things that I learned that really changed my life is we have this neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is this neurotransmitter that does a lot of things in our body and our functions in our cells, but it controls how you act socially in groups. And so obviously it's very, very important for social anxiety. It also controls your mood. It controls your energy. It controls your appetite. It controls your sleep. It controls a lot of different things. And they found that most of this serotonin, this neurotransmitter, most of sort of like our assumptions throughout human history have been, because serotonin is a neurotransmitter, most of it has got to be in our brain. And it turns out 90% of serotonin is in our gut microbiome, which is controlled directly by every single time you open your mouth and you eat food, your gut microbiome produces that. And depending on the food, depending on how stressed out you are, your gut is going to produce good bacteria or bad bacteria. Good bacteria can help you get out of depression, can help you digest better. Bad bacteria can literally make you suicidal. And like, for example, in my book where I talk about this time in college where I really fell down. And the subchapter of the book is titled, First My Gut Broke and Then My Brain Broke. And I really realized like the accumulation of all of these negative habits of our physical health and how they impact your brain. I mean, we all saw how like last year in 2020, how like literally a single virus could like literally completely change the world. We have trillions in our body. And like, for example, Harvard has called this study nutritional psychiatry. And this has been bringing people a lot of results because it's one of the things that can actually make you feel better the fastest. Right. So there's like so many different branches and layers that I can talk about, from exposure therapy to the different layers of social anxiety to whatnot. But that's one of the most like straightforward ways that I can get into. And then next, I want to talk about the layers of social anxiety, if that's okay with you. But
I just want to unpack that for just a moment, because you're so on point with that. And I completely agree with you that I think it's so important to just raise awareness of the fact that the what's the word, the diet, the fitness industry, or not just the fitness, but just the food industry, right? So all these different diets and supplements and all of that, it's all wonderful and it's great, it's out there, but everybody needs to be very aware that it goes beyond that, and that's just putting a band-aid on a broken leg, and chances are actually probably not just a band-aid, but band-aid that's going to make you even worse. And I think getting to the bottom of it is where it really matters. And I was always skeptical of kind of, nutritionists or trainers that come in and they just start giving me, like, without even getting to know me, without doing any tests, right? Like for my body specifically, checking all of my stuff, like they start recommending things and I'm like, but how? Like, it's they're doing so much damage to people. Like, you don't even know my insides, essentially. Like, you need to do something, right? And I completely agree with the fact that what sometimes you eat bad food and you're in a bad mood, and it's that simple. It's just that simple. And people don't understand how much the gut affects our brain, like you said, and everything else that we do. So I think that's so on point, and I think that is golden right there. Honestly, it's and it affects our mental health, which I want to ask you in a moment. But I know you want to mention about social anxiety.
Yeah,
so that mental health piece is definitely related to our gut as well.
Yeah, for sure. And real quick, like, there's no such thing as a universal healthy diet. There's no such thing as like, oh, everybody should go vegan, everybody should go this. It doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. But the one universal fact is that, like, over the last 75 years, 100 years, I just moved my chair. Over the last 7,500 years, humans have basically invented a new food group, and that's called processed foods, because as the Industrial Revolution began and in cities and people started working, they had less time for food. And so what we've done as an entire world, really, we have like sacrificed these things. But the thing is at what cost, right? And so, for example, there's studies that I talk about in my book that show if you start, for example, heavy drinking by the time you're 20 years old, you have like a 50% increase in getting dementia, Alzheimer's, and other brain degenerative disorders that are really terrible. There's all kinds of studies I talk about in my book that have literally shown, whether it's in teenagers or adults, that it doesn't even have to be like a short-term response. It's not even necessarily like, oh, I ate fries and then now I feel bad. There are some people out there who eat fries or eat whatever and they don't feel bad. But there's the invisible long-term consequences of that. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so in terms of just real quick, the layers of mental health, mental health, social anxiety, compared to the layers of what it means to be human, physical, mental, spiritual. When it comes to layers of social anxiety, what we can basically define social anxiety, and this comes from a friend of mine who also endorsed my book. She's a clinical psychologist by the name of Dr. Ellen Hendrickson. And she says that social anxiety is a perception that there is something wrong with you. And if you don't work hard to compensate or make up for that, everybody's going to judge you, hate you, mock you. And you can break that down into 4 layers, okay? So the first one is physical appearance. People will get socially anxious around their physical appearance. And so for me, that comes from 2 things. It comes from, number one, being in an environment where literally nobody physically looked around me. Nobody had the same skin color. I didn't really care about skin color, but your brain cares about skin color. Your brain can understand that, evolutionary speaking, and make that distinction. Number 2 was, I remember growing up poor and my parents didn't have enough money to buy me clothes. And so I would wear the same clothes to school every day. And so people would make fun of me for, wearing that. And then I also became a little bit overweight as well when I was growing up, and I was never athletic, never was active. And so I was also socially anxious about my weight too, my physical appearance. Number 2 is social skills. People will get socially anxious around their social skills. They'll say, hey, I don't know how to introduce myself to someone. If someone walks up to me, I don't know how to talk to people. Okay. The 3rd layer is your entire personality or character. And so people will be in a conversation, they'll be in a social situation, and they'll think that who they are as a person, they have no value to offer in the world. But the most important thing that I want to keep in mind is that your brain doesn't care about objective reality. And so you could be a great person, you could have a great personality, but social anxiety will make you think the opposite. Now, the last layer of social anxiety is getting socially anxious about the signs of anxiety itself. And so what do I mean is you're at an event, you're in a conversation, you're talking, someone else is talking now. And then all of a sudden you realize your heartbeat is beating really fast, your throat is clenching, you're sweating. And then you start thinking to yourself in like a meta way, you're like, wait, can people see the sweat? Can people tell that I'm nervous? Can they tell that I'm stuttering and then what'll happen is you'll create more social anxiety around that cycle of social anxiety. And so if you understand everything that I just said, it's like this, like it is a very destructive and toxic cycle where someone will try their best to be themselves. They will fail. Their brain tells them that they suck and they have no hope and they'll never change. And then what they'll do is they'll go eat junk food. They'll go not sleep. They'll go stay up all night, which then literally makes your gut microbiome and your brain worse. And it literally just creates this destructive cycle, which is why like one of the biggest reasons why I'm even talking about this in the first place is because there was a meta-analysis study done by Harvard. And what they showed was out of all of the mental health issues in the world, social anxiety is not only like the third most common, but it is the most correlated with substance abuse, social isolation, which triple your risk factor for suicide. And we live in a society where they tell you, if you want help with your, mental health, go see a doctor or a therapist or call the suicide hotline. And those are all great, but the reality is like it's hard enough for the average person to speak and ask for help when it comes to mental health. It is 100,000 times worse for someone in that position who has social anxiety, where they literally have like this mental health virus, I would call it, that literally convinces them every single day to not be themselves and to not speak up. And so I was like, let me write this book. Let me put this stuff up online. Let me do whatever I can to start the first step of this process for people to wake up and realize that they may or may not have this issue depending on the person and what they can do on their own first to where they're not extremely depressed or suicidal. And then if they want to, they can go ask for a therapist, or I also coach people with this too. And so obviously I've been working with people like that, but yeah, that's like the map of this stuff. That's very complicated. It's destructive. It's terrible. I'm so glad I made it out. I thank God every day. I'm so lucky.
Yeah, listen, I think you bring so much awareness to it's so much beyond that social anxiety. I mean, let me rephrase it. Social anxiety has so many layers, as you said, and I think that's so important to recognize. And you're absolutely right. If a person has been kind of thinking the same way, doing the same things, it's almost like they've created this routine and habit within themselves. And even in our work with our startup Western, when we talk about change and we work with organizations and employees about taking care of themselves and their well-being, and it's creating these habits because it's difficult. It's micro habits, micro changes, and those changes start with awareness. And awareness is number one to everything. And then it's just step by step. And it's like any change, you can't expect to be thinking and behaving in a certain way for years and years of your life. And all of a sudden everything will change. It doesn't work like that. But I think what you've pointed out is making small changes, even in just like your environment, what you eat, your exercise, all of that adds to those baby steps in the right direction, essentially. So I think it's so valid. It's just that awareness alone, I think, will open up a lot of people's minds. And just a final point I want to make here is that, at the end of the day, if you are a person who has somebody in your life who might be shy or introvert or whatever, have those conversations in a gentle way, be there for them, reach out. I wanted to ask you, so I know also you've gone through a lot of changes, Mark, and you have, thrived in those changes essentially. And I've read somewhere a quote that I know that your dad says, I think, and says, if you're not growing, then you're dying, right? And I think this is something you take to the heart. So I want to just ask you, as one of the couple of final questions I have for you is, how are you kind of growing these days? I know you're doing some changes when it comes to your business and kind of really shifting. So how are you growing these days?
That's a good question. So I think the most important thing that I've learned is there are like these basic foundations, but the reality is that it's a dance. And the reality is that things change in life. And so one thing that I've been really particular about is just because I think I know the answer, or just because I've gotten a particular result in my life, doesn't necessarily mean I'm right. And so what do I mean by that is like, I'm always questioning myself from like, not from like who I am or if I'm a good person, but I'm always questioning what I'm doing because, I don't think that I'm the smartest person. I don't think that I'm the best person. I don't think that I am the best person when it comes to growth or any of these, I don't know, like sort of platitudes. But the biggest thing that I've realized is that my ego is always dancing. It's always, always, always dancing. And there's never going to be a spot where I'm going to be like, oh, I arrived. Oh, I made it. Oh, I don't need to meditate anymore. I don't need to eat healthy anymore. Because a lot of the times what happens is sometimes like I'll think like that. Sometimes like, next thing I know, I don't know, my business is popping. I'm becoming very successful. Next thing I know, I like feel very happy, right? My relationships, the people around me, they're all great. My health is great. And then next thing you know, I like stop doing the things that got me here. All of a sudden I'm like, you know what? Why do I need to meditate? Why do I need to eat? Like, what do I need to do? And like literally every single time that happens, I'm like, crap. Like I need to have like a poster on my wall that's like, question yourself, but also like keep doing the things that got you there, and always experiment. And so for me, like I'm always experimenting. I try to learn like every day, like every single day of my life, I dedicate basically from 6 o'clock, like in the evening to, unless I'm like doing something, like until like 9 o'clock to literally just learning. Like I literally just go on the internet and I'm literally just like, okay, what course can I take? What TED talk can I watch? Because what I realize is if I'm not learning, then it's the way I think about it is like, like a colander, like what you filter pasta in, like when you put it and the water goes through it. Yeah. That's what we're like as humans. The water is always going. You're never going to find a way to cover all those spots, right? Because a lot of us, and then a lot of times too, we think that if we can just like get this water and we can like keep it with us, then our problems will be good. But the reality is like, that's how you have dirty water. That's not how you have clean water. And so for me, I've just made it a point to like always be having water run through me, whether that's conversations with people or podcasts, or always trying to learn. Like, for example, like now, one of the things that I've been doing is, like, as I've been becoming like a coach, I've been taking like different courses by like therapists and other like people on how to like not psychoanalyze people, but how do you psychoanalyze people in the appropriate way while knowing that you yourself may be flawed and you may be wrong. And then also, how do you make sure that you don't get emotionally caught up in people to where you bring their problems into your life and then into your home. And so, yeah, I'm always learning. And honestly, the times where I don't feel like I'm learning, I just straight up, I'm like, what am I doing with my life? And so it's a constant cycle.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And it's an important part you mentioned about coaches and therapists. And something I learned the hard way is, do you know that therapists, every like 8 sessions or 9 sessions, they have to have the therapy session themselves to be able to unload all of that energy that they take on. Yeah. So, and I said, as coaches, I think we should do that as well, is to learn how to kind of put that blocker. And so, yeah, it's because that can become very dangerous when you start to get emotionally connected, and all, especially as empaths. Sometimes you kind of take on a lot of people's energies. It can be really detrimental to you. So, kudos to you for like trying to learn how to do that. Thing is super important. Listen, you know what I can also relate to, and I don't know if this happens to you, but for me, so I'm completely aligned with you that we should continue learning. But one of the biggest things I struggle with, and we're not going to have time to get into this now, but I thought it's important that when things are going well and you're almost like, you start thinking about what could possibly go wrong. Like you can't just enjoy. I don't know if this happens to you, but I get into a point where I'm like, when things are just great and I'm like, oh, like something bad's coming. I can't just enjoy this moment and like just be in it. Does that happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, it used to definitely used to happen. I mean, it doesn't really happen that often, but it used to happen to me a lot.
Yeah.
Like the feeling that you're always like turned, not turned on, but like your brain is always like on. You can't shut off like the incessant like part of you that wants to control
Yeah,
everything.
they say it's like the ego or something, which I'm still trying to figure out. They say it's like the ego just tries to find issues when in fact everything is just fine, and you're supposed to be okay. You're not supposed to have challenges, but I'm like, okay,
Definitely are supposed to have challenges.
Yeah, right. Like you are supposed to have challenges.
I mean, yeah, I mean, what I would say is this. I would say life is inherently suffering. I don't mean that to be harsh, but like if you literally think about it, life is basically at the most like empirical level. Life is basically like trillions of cells that are combined as atoms, as energy that go through while literally things try to kill you. That's literally what life is.
Yeah.
Whether that's by food, the animals, no sleep, mental health issues, like that's what life is. And like that's the reality. And so what I would say is there's always a part of your brain that is accustomed to that. And so what I would say is like we create these problems, whether it's starting a business or doing this, as a way to, I wouldn't say distract ourselves from the inherent sense of suffering that we're going to die one day, but we kind of do. And so what I would say is like, you have to always be doing something that's meaningful. And then what I would say too, the other side of that is like, what I've realized is that anxiety, like this, and by anxiety, I mean like this internal sense of control for your mental and emotional that may go good or bad. Basically what I've learned is like that anxiety is like a thermometer, okay, in a room, okay? And so let's say the thermometer sit on 75 degrees, okay? And let's say you decide to like go on vacation, right? And so you take the hot temperature and you're like, hey, I'm going to cool down. I'm going to relax, right? And you take that thermometer, you bring it down to like 68 degrees, for example, right? What's going to happen is once you step in that environment that's 68, that's around you, the temperature is 68, but you have this internal thermometer that says 75, it doesn't matter what the external environment, your brain, your anxiety will, it'll bring you back up to 75, regardless of your external scenario. And then same when you get hot, when you are surrounded by a lot of stress and you're like, let's say the temperature is 80 degrees. And like, let's say like that means that you're running a successful business. That same anxiety part is going to be like, nah, I don't think you can do it. And it's going to bring you back down. Right. And so what I think it's the real skill of it's learning, how do I have what I would say mental, emotional flexibility around my states of mind? And how can I teach myself to go from 75, instead of 75 to 68, how can I teach myself to go from 75 to 74? And then you do these micro habits for years. And then all of a sudden you're like, now my default is on 73, but it takes years and years and years and years of work to do it. And so, yeah, it's very interesting. But what I would say is like, literally, it doesn't matter like whether you have $100 billion in your bank account. It doesn't matter if you have the best family friend scenario. It doesn't matter if you're the healthiest person in the world. The problem of existing and suffering is always going to be there. And so what I would say is take responsibility for that and take on problems proactively so that you can, in a meaningful way, distract yourself. Because if you sit there, like it's going to happen. And like, for example, I don't know if you meditate, but when you meditate and you're sitting in the spot where you have no stimuli, you have nothing to distract you, it's just you in the darkness of your mind, you truly figure out how crazy you are. Like, I don't know how else you truly figure out, you're like, oh my God, true. I have all these thoughts. And like the reality is you can change that. It's like a muscle, you can work on it, but that is always, always, always going to exist. And then this gets into a deeper meaning of what is meaning? Does life have meaning? Does it matter? Which is actually going to be my next newsletter topic. It's super deep. I think that's actually the biggest problem that people are experiencing today for a variety of issues facing. I don't know if you've heard of nihilism. and life doesn't have meaning and different things like that.
Oh, I look forward to that.
Yeah.
I love your newsletters. Speaking of newsletters, listen, you produce a lot of content. I've been following your content for a couple of years, and I love it. And I'm loving the newsletter, by the way. And so where can people find you? Where do you, I know you hang out everywhere, but where do people go? Where can they buy your book?
Yeah, so if people just go to my website, markmetry.com, my first and last name, you'll have a link to put the email newsletter, the book, podcasts, my social media. You can email me, contact me. I think I even have a phone number there. You can text me.
Yeah, nice. No, listen, your content is really on point, and I've told you this a couple of times that you are one of those people that challenge my thoughts. And sometimes I remember I would post something, and you'd be like, "Yeah, okay, but what about this?" And you I'm like, he's right. Oh, okay, you make me think. So, and I appreciate you for that. And I really think more people should check out the things that you put out there. They're super valuable. So listen, final thoughts. I would, if there's anything you think that if there's a person listening and they might be dealing with social anxiety, or perhaps, they're just a shy person, whatever it may be. I know you've given a lot of different tips today, but what is the one key takeaway you think that they can put into action today?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that I would say is that people with social anxiety, they work so hard and they don't know it. But the issue with working hard versus working smart is you wake up every morning and you do the same thing. You try to break it down, you brute force it. The reality is that's not how mental health works. That's not how social anxiety works. If you do that, you will become depressed. And what you'll do is you'll say to yourself, oh my God, I'm working so hard to do these things, but I'm not getting the results and I still feel like a loser. And that's how people lose faith. They get off a totally different track. They do worse things. And so what I would say to that person is that's the issue. You need to stop and you need to learn. You need to reach out to people who are smarter than you, that are either people like me who have lived like this for a decade of their life and they've climbed out. You need to talk to neuroscientists. You need to read their books, because it's not common sense. You can't just work hard about it. But once you start learning these mechanisms, what you do realize is that there is a proven, scientifically credible, sustainable, and a realistic path that hundreds of thousands of people around the world have taken. But what you need to do is you need to stop thinking that you know all the answers, that you think you got it yourself. You don't. And God forbid you end up in a scenario like me where I was depressed and I felt like my brain broke and I was suicidal. Don't wait to get to that spot, because the reality is that it actually gets worse if you don't address this later on. And next thing you know, you're going to be 55 years old and you're literally going to lose your free will. And even the habits that you try to implement, it's going to get harder and harder and harder the longer you wait. And so get proactive about it. Stop thinking you know everything yourself and actually learn about it from people like me or professionals in the space. And if you do that and you get on the right path, it literally becomes a math formula. Obviously, it's not that simple, but it literally becomes a mathematical formula where it's it's not about whether you're talented or you're a good person or not. It's literally a scientific mathematical formula that anybody can do if they have the right knowledge tools. And so obviously check out my book. If you want to reach out to me, if you want to work with me, obviously reach out, anything like that. Subscribe to Elena's podcast. Make sure you leave her a good review on Apple, on iTunes. She works very hard. I'm sure she would appreciate it. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been so awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.